Thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining us today, courtesy of Chabad of Rechavia here in Yerushalayim. It's good to see everyone. We started we are at the beginning today, B'ezrat Hashem, the second parak, second chapter of Rambam, Hilchot Yesodei Hatorah. Yiratzon melefnecha, Adonai Eloheinu, shelo ye'era davar takala al yidi, v'lo akashel b'dvar halacha, ve'yismachu bi chaverai, shelo omar al tameh tahor, v'lo al tahor tameh, v'lo al mutar asur, v'lo al asur mutar, v'lo ikashelu chaverai b'dvar halacha, yismacha bahem, ki Adonai iten chochma mipiv da'at u'tvuna, gal einai ve'abita niflaot b'tvoratecha. Thank you for joining us. A question came up in the last couple of weeks. We discussed the notion of, we raised the question of, does everybody actually believe in or worship the same God? There are two concepts that are bandied about very much, certainly in Western culture, as though they were universally true and everybody agrees to them. One is that people are all fundamentally really the same, deep down. And the other is that deep down, all religions actually worship the same God. And I offered my opinion that I'm not so sure that I believe either of those statements anymore. And was asked, what book can I read that will talk about not all people serving or worshiping the same God? Excuse me. And the answer is actually, we do have a book that very much addresses the notion that not everybody worships the same God. And that book is called the Torah. And throughout Tanakh, the notion of the correct God versus the other gods that people in the world worship is something that comes up over and over and over again. And I want to focus on that for just a moment because it's a very strong and I think a very important lead-in to the beginning of this second parak. Excuse me. We say in the morning service every day, Baruch atah Hashem, yotzer or uvre choshech, oseh shalom uvre et hakol. You make light and you create darkness, you make peace and you create everything. And we may not even be aware, and we often lose sight of the source of that, which is a pasuk in Yeshayahu, a verse from the book of Isaiah. And it's a very important book, a very important verse. It's chapter 45, verse 7 of Isaiah. Isaiah is speaking to the Persian emperor Koresh, Cyrus, and announcing to Cyrus that God has chosen Cyrus as God's instrument. Cyrus will then subsequently send the Jewish people back to rebuild the city of Jerusalem and rebuild the Beit HaMikdash. Cyrus, excuse me, as the emperor of Persia, is the prime, the leader of a nation that has as its official religion Zoroastrianism, which not really completely firm on all the dates, but as I understand it, for certainly 100 years or so prior to the encounter between Cyrus and Isaiah, Zoroastrianism had been the official and the widespread religion in the Persian Empire. And Zoroastrianism is basically what we call a form of Manichaeism. There are two gods. There's a God who creates good and a God who creates evil. There's a God of light and the God of darkness. And all of cosmic history is a war between the forces of light and the forces of darkness, the forces of good and the forces of evil. Isaiah is saying to Cyrus something which was not, when you think about it, it's not only radical to someone with Cyrus's mindset, with Cyrus's understanding of the cosmos, but remains radical today. And remains so radical today that we often have a hard time taking it in and comprehending it ourselves when we really think about it. What Isaiah is saying is that the God who created the world, one God created the entire world, and that God creates good. And that God equally creates evil. And wrap your mind around that. Because beyond the God who creates good and evil and everything, there is nothing. As Rambam said very definitively in the first parak, we saw in the first chapter, talks about the single source of all existence. And if it's a single source of all existence, then it must be the source of all aspects of existence. That's something that human beings have a hard time with. We like to have good guys and bad guys. And when we contemplate what that does to our view of the world, some very interesting and very troubling notions arise from this, okay? What kind of a world view, what kind of a mindset does a Zoroastrian have? Zoroastrian has a mindset which is actually very convenient, which is that there are good guys and bad guys. There is good and there is evil. I want to be good. P.S. Anything that I do, I'm going to interpret as being good anyway, so I must be one of the good guys. And anybody that does anything that disagrees with me or that bothers me, something that I don't like, well, there's a good chance that that person's a bad guy. What Isaiah is saying, the underlying message and the message of Torah is that the world is not that simple. The world is not black and white. We live in a world that thrives on black and white. We live in a world where, in every age, people have always said, oh, things have never been as bad as they are today. So without saying that things have never been as bad as they are today, I think we can all agree that we live in a highly polarized society. I think we can all agree that we live in a society and we live in contact and in exchange with many other societies where, where people take very strong, unwavering sides for or against, where people disqualify other people because of a single notion that somebody might express, because of an opinion that someone might express, because of the person or the political party that they might have voted for in the last election, because of their discomfort around certain social groups, ethnic groups, racial. And so we embrace or reject one another based quite often on a single factor. You voted for so-and-so, you can't be my friend anymore. Oh, you don't like those kind of people, you can't be my friend anymore. What the Torah is saying is the world is an incredibly complex place. It's so complex that only God can understand it. Don't try to understand all of it, but also don't reject what we don't understand. Excuse me. This is an incredibly difficult challenge. It's also a challenge which I believe Rambam today still uniquely puts in front of us. Rambam is such an amazing thinker, such an amazingly powerful individual in the history, not just of Jewish thought, but of all thought. The challenge for us to free ourselves from dogma, which means, first of all, looking at our own beliefs, means, first of all, insisting on challenging our own beliefs. Because unless we challenge our own beliefs, we will never have a mind that's open to receive knowledge, much less wisdom. Knowledge of other people, understanding of other people, knowledge and understanding of how God's world operates, and Bezrat Hashem, God willing, wisdom that comes through deepening our study in Revelation, in our practice, and our embrace of Torah. So there's much more to be said on this, but I wanted to just introduce us with the notion that, we'll call it with a small L, liberal mindset, which is the mindset that says, okay, I don't agree with this, but what is there to it? Or how can another person believe in something if I don't agree with it? Rabbi Dr. Norman Lamb, who was the head of, among other things, who was the head of Yeshiva University for many years and the major proponent of what came to be called modern orthodoxy, basically, without having a doctrine about it, he insisted that the intellectual component of Torah study, the intellectual component of the Jewish life, is not to look to science to replace Torah, God forbid, not to look to philosophy, not to look to secular studies to replace Torah, but the insistence that we must always have intellectual curiosity. And intellectual curiosity, by definition, by its very nature, presupposes that I don't know everything, presupposes that what I learned yesterday, I might have to unlearn today, because the world always offers us new information. And so in that vein, excuse me, I invite us all to begin to dive into the second chapter of Hilchot Yesodei Hatorah of Rambam.
Can I ask something?
Please.
Okay. You said he creates bad or whatever. Good. Is there a potential that God could create the potential of evil, but by our acts we bring that evil into reality?
You're asking me a theological question. I will go first to the plain meaning of the pasuk. The plain meaning is, I created everything. You think that there's a war between a force of good and a force of evil? One way of looking at it is, it's not really a war. It all comes from me. So, that's right. So I will answer you off the top of my head. I will answer your question by saying, no, that's not accurate. We do not make evil. God creates evil. God said so.
Can we create the potential and we bring it into reality?
God created us as beings of potential.
How can reality come about if we're put here and our actions either bring good or bad? Our actions are what creates everything. Everything is here because of us. We create the reality. We choose good or bad. So if we choose a certain way, it brings that into a creative reality.
Well, we don't know. Everything is not here because of us. Everything is here because of God. God who creates everything. And within that system, we are individuals who we believe uniquely have choice and the ability through our actions to do good or evil. But the good or evil, according to, I'm not making this up, right? It's right there in Tanakh, right? According to God's word, the good or the evil are part of the, let's call it the divine plan. They're part of what God created. I don't want to let God off the hook by blaming myself for the existence of evil in the world. It's bigger than that. That's why I said this is today this remains one of the most challenging concepts in Torah. The fact that everything comes from God. We can't pick and choose. We can't say everything came from God except the person who stabbed somebody last week. We can't say everything comes from God except for the suicide bomber, except for the concentration camps, except for. It all comes from God. It's a big challenge. I don't know how it all comes from God.
I see it the other way too. I see the good also. Potential of good is there, and we
not potential, but that's the point. It's not potential. It's the actuality, right? The reality. Because if we start saying, well, it's the potential for good, and it's the potential for evil, I fear that my take on it is that we can then our thinking and our discourse can spill back over into this black and white, into this Manichaeist, the Zoroastrian worldview. You have the potential for good and the potential for evil. That's what God set before you. You chose evil, you're a bad guy. It doesn't work that way. Humanity is not. Let's take a look at what Rambam says here, which is not a continuation of this discussion, but I think it's important that we had this discussion.
How can he wipe Sodom and Gomorrah? He says, okay, I'm sad I created this.
Yep.
So I destroyed it. But didn't they believe in the potential? He didn't want to destroy it. They created the reality for that.
Well, God said, I regret doing this.
Regret making them.
Okay.
But it seems to me.
Let's see what let's.
Good or bad, we make.
No, I disagree. I not only disagree. I will tell you that. I will tell you that I think from a Jewish perspective, what you're saying is wrong. We are responsible for our actions 100%.
Right.
100%. And Rambam is very firm on that all over the place. We saw that very clearly in Hilchot Teshuvah, in the laws of repentance. We're 100% responsible for our actions. But we can't let God off the hook for the way God creates this universe. We're part of the ball of wax, right? So I'm not, and again, I don't have a simple, I can't draw you a Rube Goldberg contraption of how it works. But I'm just saying that God is telling us right up front, all of the stuff that you don't like in the world, it comes from me the same as all the stuff that you do like in the world. And I would say, if you look at the, again, this is getting like, it's fine. I'm happy to have this conversation, right? Read my book, The Weight of Gold. The episode of Nadav and Avihu, of Aaron's sons who die at the Chanukat Habayit, at the dedication of the Mishkan in the desert, right? This is, in a certain sense, this is literally, I mean, if you will, geographically, it's the center of the Torah. It's like right in the middle of it's the middle parsha of the middle book of the Torah. And it's a central episode because it tells us it shows us very clearly how delicate is that balance between good and evil, between what we perceive as good and evil, between what we perceive as right and wrong, between what we perceive as our obligations and responsibilities with respect to our relationship with God, and what we perceive as God's obligations and responsibilities with respect to God's relationship with us. This religion, Torah, is not a simple process, okay? Which is why somebody like Rambam, who helps to guide us through certainly behavior and understanding, is it's invaluable. It's essential. We can't even figure out which way is up if we're left to our own devices. Notice that ever since Torah came into the world, Torah was given 3,500 years ago, and ever since then, thousands and thousands and thousands of the most intelligent and most spiritual, most dedicated people in human history have spent their entire lives trying to figure out what it means. So, there, but we've got a lot to work with.
So how do we know what good is unless we know what evil is?
Says Rambam. Ha'el hanichbad v'hanora hazeh mitzvah le'ahavo u'lira'a oto. This God, this awesome and glorious God, the one that we spent the whole first parak describing, it is a mitzvah to love this God and to fear this God. Shne'amar, as it says in the pasuk, ve'ahavta et Hashem Elokecha, and you shall love the Lord your God. V'ne'amar et Hashem Elokecha tira, and there's also a pasuk that says, you shall fear the Lord your God. Paragraph 2. Now, this is incredibly important. These first two paragraphs of this parak are incredibly important. And if we do nothing more than kind of work our way through these two paragraphs today, I think we will have accomplished a lot. This is really critical to understanding Rambam's entire project and how we are to relate to God. Because again, remember, Rambam's project is not, yes, he brings us the halachas, and yes, he's a master of halacha, and yes, throughout Mishnah Torah, he is very explicit, with his instructions as to how to observe the various halachas. But the halacha for Rambam is not the end of the line. It is, the world is a complex place, right? We can't say, well, I live a spiritual life while I live a physical life. We live both, and the conflict starts right there. And when we want to talk about a conflict between, this is good or this is evil, well, no, it's both. They're all contained within the world. We human beings are a soul in a body. Just like a married couple is not a man and a woman, it's a married couple together, right? And if you look at the first couple in history, which is Adam and Eve, it says, and the language that the Torah uses, it's interesting. It says that they will cleave together and become one flesh. That same language is used in laws of kashrut today to describe what happens when a piece of forbidden meat is not cut off from the piece of permitted meat before it's kosher. Okay. In other words, they become indistinguishable. They become a single unit. Okay. So we are also a single unit with God in God's creation. And how do we deal with that? And how do we deal particularly with these initial commandments that Rambam is bringing to us now, to love God and to fear God? Now, Rambam has his own view of how this process works. Here in the second paragraph, and what is this? How does this work, this path to attaining the love and the fear of God? בשעה שיתבונן האדם במעשיו וברואיו ונפלאים הגדולים. At the moment that a person contemplates God's wondrous and great deeds and creations, ויראה מהן חוכמתו. And so the translation here says, and when a person contemplates God's wondrous and great deeds and creations and appreciates God's wisdom. But the word veyir'eh mehen chokhmato, again, the word for vision is also the base of the word for admiration. It's also the base for the word fear. And he's using that word here. So just be aware that Rambam uses the Hebrew language in a very precise fashion. So I'm not sure that appreciates in this translation here quite does justice to the impact of the word. V'yir'eh mehen chokhmato. A person that I would say is bowled over by the wisdom of God. She'en la erech v'lo ketz, that has no dimensions and no limits. Miyad hu ohev u'mishabeach u'mfa'er u'mitaveh ta'ava gedola le'eda Hashem hagadol. Immediately, once we recognize and we're bowled over by the greatness of God's wisdom, immediately we love and we praise and we glorify and we have a tremendous yearning to find out about God. Again, the use of this verb le'eda, to come to know this God, this great God. Moshe amar David, tzam'a nafshi le'elohim le'el chai, as it says in Tehillim, my soul thirsts for God, for the living God. וכשמחשב בדברים האלו עצמן, מיד הוא נרתע לאחריו וירא ויפחד, ויודע שהוא בראייה קטנה, שפלה אפלה, עומדת בדעת קלה, מעוטה לפני תמים דעות. And immediately, when we reflect on these matters, on the greatness of God, now we will immediately recoil in awe and fear, appreciating how we are a tiny, lowly, dark creature standing with our flimsy, limited wisdom before God, the one who is of perfect knowledge. As David HaMelech says in Tehillim, Ki er'eh shamecha ma'aseh etzba'otecha ma enosh ki tizkerenu. When I behold your heavens and the work of your fingers, what is a human being that you should even pay attention to us, that you should acknowledge us? I'm sorry, I'm missing something here. Excuse me. Hi. ולפי הדברים האלו, אני מבאר כללים גדולים במעשה ריבון העולמים. And based on these concepts, now I will clarify, I will explain very important principles regarding of the worlds. כדי שיהיו פתח למבין לאהוב את השם, כמו שאמרו חכמים בעניין אהבה, שמתוך כך אתה מכיר את מי שאמר והיה עולם. So based on these concepts now, I will explain very important principles regarding the deeds of the Creator, the Master of all worlds. And as he says here, to provide a foothold for a person of understanding to develop his love for God. As Chazal have said regarding love, thus in this manner you will recognize the one who spoke and brought the world into being. Have any thoughts, any questions, comments about what Rambam says here?
No, I think we're okay. Thank you.
Okay. No, well, I find it interesting that that Rambam sees this as a natural progression. That he sees the progression as there is an intellectual perception which generates an emotion, which is love and the desire to praise. So it seems, and I think this is borne out in other of Rambam's writings, that Rambam is telling us that the human being has a natural propensity for religion, that a human being has an innate spiritual need, that a human being has an innate need to connect to some spiritual reality beyond my own being.
Ratzon Elyon.
Excuse me?
Ratzon Elyon.
Ratzon Elyon, which I think is fundamental to the way that we view the world, right? But also notice something interesting, right? So v'yirei mehen chochmato, and a person sees or beholds or is astonished, if you will, appreciates God's wisdom from seeing God's creation. Then, says Rambam, a great love naturally develops within us, springs forth within us, if you will, and a desire then to go out and to praise. We then, once we have this desire to praise God and to serve God, we then start to kind of pick apart what we have perceived, and we realize that within the grand scheme of things, we are nothing. We are very lowly. We are shafela afela. At that point, we are then overwhelmed with fear, if you will. Fear, perhaps we might call it awe. It's not necessarily the kind of fear that he uses the word here, yirah, not pachad. Word pachad, which is more like terror or physical fear, if you will, is used in other contexts with respect to other concepts that Rambam will discuss later on. And I would just like to point out that although many Rambam scholars categorically reject that Rambam has any connection to Kabbalah or mysticism, describing here, to me, looks an awful lot like the process that the Alter Rebbe describes in Tanya, the process of Chabad, that there is first that Chochma bin Adat, that first there is an intellectual perception, which Rambam says, you see and you understand the greatness from looking at the world. You say, wow, the thing, whoever created this, that's really amazing. From that intellectual perception, an emotion springs forth. It's the emotion of love, of the desire to serve, the desire to connect. And then we start exploring, and we start figuring out. The way I'm reading this is what Rambam is describing is, once this love blossoms within us, we then need to figure out the nuts and bolts and mechanics of how we are going to serve this God. And once we start looking at that, kind of, the first question we ask ourselves is, wait a minute, this God who creates everything, what can I possibly do for this God? If I have a God that's a little bit more limited, like a statue, or a God who only does good, and I need to be nice to this God, or a God who only does evil and I need to appease the God to make sure that the evil doesn't happen to me, well, it's kind of very simple. I'll slaughter a chicken, I'll burn some incense, I'll sing a song. Great. This God's got everything, creates everything, way beyond anything that I could ever possibly think of to do for this God. And so what do we do? And at that point, he says we're overwhelmed and we experience fear. And I would just point out that also one of the other things that we tend to experience, which Rambam's not talking about here, but it's not to be minimized, is we can also have a sense of despair, a sense of despair of how can I ever connect to this God? And this is an aspect of our relationship with God, which again is more prevalent in a lot of Hasidic thought. But I think it's also something that we should acknowledge. Right, now Rambam now is going to spend the rest of this parak and then the next two prakim giving us his own metaphysics, if you will. So fasten your seatbelts and let's just, let's see what Rambam has to say about how God creates the world and the structure of the spheres and the angels and so on and so forth. Okay, paragraph 3. Kol ma shebarah hakadosh baruch hu be'olamo nechalak leshlosha halakim. Everything that God creates in God's world is divided into 3 categories. Mehen, and they can include Beru'im she'em mechubarim me'golem v'tzorah. Okay. They include creations which are a combination of matter, and form. Em hovim v'nifsadim tamid. And these things come into existence and go out of existence constantly. Kamo, for example, gufot ha'adam, ve'habehema, ve'hatzmachim, ve'hammetachot. Like the bodies of human beings and the bodies of animals and plants and minerals. In other words, the whole physical world is something that by its very nature comes into existence. And they're also, mehen bo'im, shehen mechubarim migolem v'tzora, aval enan mishtanim miguf leguf, u'mitzora letzora, kamo harishonim. And then there's the second category, which are also made of matter and form, but they don't change from body to body and form to form, like the ones in the first category. Ela tzoratan kivu'a le'olam be'galmam ve'enan mishtanim kemo elu. But their form is eternally fixed in matter, and they don't change like the others. And these include hagalgalim ve'kochavim shebehem.
Excuse me, you said fixed or
fixed.
Eternal?
Yeah.
Eternal?
צורתן קבועה לעולם בגולמם ואינן משתנים כמו אלו. That their form is fixed forever in their physical being, and they don't change like the previous ones. And these include the spheres and the stars within the sphere. Right? And I'm not going to get into a whole, discussion of the history of the philosophy of science of, we believed it then, we don't believe it now, this is whatever. This is the world as Rambam is describing it to us. It's a world in which there are 9 spheres that surround our earth. And these spheres have, in some way that we cannot describe, we cannot define, they have a physical reality to them. Rambam is saying that they are eternal. And when we look up into the sky and we see the stars, what we're seeing is a star, which is an eternal physical being that is fixed at a certain spot on its sphere, which is itself a physical eternal being. And that sphere is going to rotate forever and forever and forever. And Rambam tells us that the mechanism of the universe is that there is a sphere will not turn by itself. It needs an outer force to propel it, and that outer force is God. And it never stops. And it's an eternal process. And finally, there are and then there are tzura below golem klal. And then there are forms that have no matter. Behem hamalachim. שהמלאכים אינם גוף וגבייה, אלא צורות נפרדות זו מזו. And angels do not have a physical form. They don't have a physical embodiment. They're not material beings. And nonetheless, they differ from one another in form. So in order to, again, I would encourage us, and I'm not saying that there's a right answer, but I think it's important for us, we may even want to take this book, sit down and look at it and kind of start mapping out how Rambam views the physical. Because as with Zoroastrianism, for example, every cosmology, every theology implies a way for us to behave as human beings with one another, and a way for us to behave in our relationship with God. And I think, from a first observation, what Rambam is telling us is that there are visible and invisible forces in the world that we need to be aware of. And they will on occasion interact to affect our lives. Some of them will interact and affect our lives constantly, like the motion of the spheres. And at the same time, we do not interact to affect the way that they behave. מה זה שהנביאים אומרים שראו המלאך ish ubal kanafayim. So now Rambam is getting back on his anti-anthropomorphism horse, right? What is this that we read when in the prophetic books, when the prophets say that they saw an angel who was fire and had wings? Hakol b'mar'eh hanvuah v'derech hida. All of this is a prophetic vision and comes, if you will, through parables. Okay. Remember, it's very important. The Rambam said, as we saw last time, that each prophet sees the prophetic message in their own way. And so different prophets will call it the same message, right? And the prophetic message is often, throughout the prophets, is often very simple and very similar, which is the society is going wrong. You have to do justice. God's going to get angry and we're going to have a problem. Okay. And yet, if you read the prophetic books, the visions and the poetry from prophet to prophet, from book to book, are wildly different and quite often very, very powerful. And so what he's saying is that when a prophet talks about an angel of fire with wings of fire, this is a vision and a parable. Okay. Because the angels don't have bodies. And the angel doesn't have like a physical weight. As it says, God is a consuming fire. God's not a fire. But again, this is a metaphor. Similarly, it says in Tehillim, in the book of Psalms, God makes his angels as winds. Again, these are all metaphors. But what it does help us to do is to be aware that we don't live in a metaphoric world. We live in an actual world. And when the prophets use metaphors like wind, like thunder, rain, sunshine, fire, what they're saying is all of these natural forces that we respond to, they are an embodiment of God. And so at the very least, we need to look around us and realize that everything, and again, I don't know how creation works, right? But it is God's creation, that God dwells within everything and every person with whom we come in contact. So with people, we have an explicit pasuk, right? Tselem Elohim, that each person's face is, if you will, the face of God. It's metaphoric, but it's also real. And everything that we come in contact with, if you go down, like Arizal says, that there are neshamot, that every little physical thing in the world, stones and pieces of paper, they have their own neshama. It's a kind of a neshama, which is another way of expressing that every minutest particle of creation embodies God's created, at the very least, what Rambam tells us is God's, if you will, creative force. And one thing that I think Rambam does not clarify, because he can't, is how that creation works. In other words, was creation like a once and for all thing and then God kind of oversees it, or is it an ongoing emanation? And I'm not going to try to answer. I'm just going to say that, we have different ways that we can look at this, but it's unquestionable from Rambam's perspective that God inhabits our world at every level and at every particle. And at the same time, that when we read these descriptive passages in Tanakh, what they're telling us is not that God has a big hand, but they're telling us that God has power beyond our ability to comprehend.
When we listen in the Chumash, Malach saying, "Antishlachet yadcha," can be the conscience. If the Malach is not a Malach, but it's something different, Malach is just a mashal. Can we say this is the conscience of Avraham himself?
You're talking about the Akedah? Al tishlach yadcha al hanar. Well, the pasuk says it's a malach. So I think, going on what Rambam is telling us, I think we would say that, I think Rambam would say, and again, I'm not speaking for Rambam, but I'm doing the best I can to try to understand what we're reading here. I think Rambam would say that this force that we cannot understand, cannot comprehend, was dispatched by God to convey a specific message to Abraham at a specific time. And so the Malach, if you want to say that the problem, I think, you're raising now another, here we go with another theological question, right? You're raising the question of, does Abraham not kill Yitzchak because of his own conscience? I think that's I think that's not consistent with the simple direct reading of the text. I think the simple direct reading of the text is that there are things going on different levels of creation. And at the level of creation where God chooses to intervene in human action, God can intervene in human action, I guess, in one of two ways. Or through a messenger, through an angel. Through an angel, through a messenger. Through a miracle or through a messenger. And Chazal tell us that God really doesn't like doing miracles. God doesn't like reversing the course of nature. But, we're also at a time in human history before the Torah was given where God and Abraham are working out the relationship, if you will. And so God, God says, okay, I'm giving you a message. And I see that you're ready to carry out my instructions. And this, again, the simple reading of the text, and huge books have been written and continue to be written about the Akedah, about what really happened there, what should have happened there, how did it happen. But the simple reading of the text, and I think consistent with the way Rambam is describing his cosmology here, is that there was a malach, a form without a substance, that some cosmic divine energy that came to Abraham spoke and prevented him from carrying through the action.
Why not conscience himself of Abraham?
Because conscience leaves it up to the human being. And I think that's not the simple reading.
Conscience is a ratzon elyon.
Sorry?
Couldn't we say that conscience is a ratzon elyon? As a matter of fact, Rashi says that, if I remember, at that moment he realized that God said, Va'aleu, lo v'shachateu. This is not angel. This is not angel.
Yeah, is that the Rivite? I'm not sure. Okay, see, this goes back to what we were struggling with earlier. Okay. I think we need to go to a very basic level, and we can maybe build up from there. But I am reluctant to say at this point in our learning of this sefer, and at this point in our discussion of this particular passage in Tanakh of the Akedah, I'm reluctant to say that Abraham was motivated by his conscience to not kill his son. I think that opens a whole different. I'm not saying that that's not a valid line of inquiry, but certainly separate from the world that Rambam is describing right here.
So what would they mean for the angel?
An angel came.
Between the angel and Abraham himself. What is the angel? But the angel is a metaphor. Rambam said the angel is a metaphor.
No, that's the point. Rambam says the angels are real. The metaphor is when we talk about the angel with wings of fire. The metaphor, and I would say even perhaps the metaphor would be if we describe the angel as having how angels operate. But where we're at right now at the beginning of Rambam's structure of the cosmos, angels are real forces. They are forces that do not have a physical being. But the angel itself is not a metaphor. When the Navi says, "Oh, I saw the angel and he was 12 feet tall with wings of fire and a sword in his hand," all metaphoric. Okay, or that is the way. Again, that's Dibra Torah Lashon Bnei Adam. That's the Torah speaking in human terminology because it's the only language we have. But the angel itself, according to Rambam, is real. how the angel is embodied and how the angel communicates, I have no idea. And I'm not sure that Rambam understands the mechanics of all that either, right? Which is not a knock on the Rambam. Okay, God forbid. Okay. And he says right here, paragraph 5. How are these forms, the angels, how is it possible that they can be separated one from another? Because they don't have any bodies. They don't have physical being. In that they're in a hierarchy of essence, of power, one ranked above the other. והוא מצוי מכוחו. זה למעלה מזה. והכל נמצאים מכוחו של הקדוש ברוך הוא וטובו. And they're all ranked one above the other according to their level of influence, if you will. And they exist in this progression, one above the other, and it all exists thanks to or by virtue of the existing power that comes from God. Right? And when we say ze she'amarnu, and this which we just said, lemata mim'alato shel chavero, that one angel is above the level of the other one, ena ma'alat makom. It's not a physical up and down. Like a person sitting on a higher up chair or sitting on a higher row of benches or whatever. But like we say about two chachamim, two scholars, or one is greater than the other in knowledge, in wisdom. That one is higher, quote unquote, than the level of the other one. As we say about cause and effect, right? That the cause is above the effect, right? But again, it's not a physical relationship. It's not a spatial relationship. Now he gives a whole list of the names of the angels. Excuse me. We're just going to read quickly through. They're the Hayot, which are above all of the others. There's the Ofanim, the Erilim, the Chashmalim, the Seraphim, the Malachim, the Elohim, Bnei Elohim, the Kruvim, and the Ishim. And these are different terms, most of which appear in one form or another in Tanakh, and a lot of them appear in the various prophetic books.
What should the Ishim be?
Sorry?
What should the Ishim?
Ishim, in the footnote here, he says this comes from Yechezkel. And Rambam says that these are in the vision of Yechezkel, these are the lowest level of malachim, if you will, the ones that are quote unquote closest to us, or perhaps closest meaning most like us, and in a sense maybe maybe we're most capable of believing that we understand them because they're in a certain respect closest to us.
Can a person be a malach?
Again, please.
Can a person be a malach? I heard somebody saying about Feinstein is a malach.
Wonderful. You're asking me my opinion? I don't know. You're asking me what Rambam would say? I think the answer would be no.
Think he?
No. I think Rambam would say no, because malachim are malachim. He just said that they are forms without substance.
Okay.
Meaning that in some way that we can't really comprehend, or at least I can't really fully explain. They are some kind of divine influences. They are influences that interact when appropriate for them to interact with the physical world. Okay? And I think primarily, in our cosmology, we have groups of angels whose job is to sit around the divine throne and sing to God all day. And then there's other groups of angels whose job is to come and interact with us and say to Abraham, don't kill your son, for example. Okay. But kol hatzorot ha'elu hayim. ומכירים את הבורא, ויודעים אותו דעה גדולה עד למאוד. Now, all of these created beings, these spiritual forms, okay, not human beings, but all these spiritual forms, they are alive. They have something called Chaim. And makirim et habore veyod'im oto de'a gdola ad le'meod. So I think it's very important. This is a very, very important sentence that Rambam is telling us here, that these forms have something that human beings don't have. They have dat of God. They have knowledge. And Rambam used the verb le'da at the very beginning of this sefer, meaning to come to know, to find out, to learn about. He used it again at the beginning of this verse. Of this chapter, that he said that once we see the greatness of God's creation, that we immediately love, ואוהב ומשבח ומפאר ומתאווה תאווה גדולה להשם הגדול. That we love and we praise and we glorify and we have a tremendous yearning to get to know, le'da. So on the one hand, we might, if our first reaction to that is, well, why don't we know? I would say the other way of looking at it is that this is our great gift. Our great gift is that God has given us our intellect, our senses as part of our physical being, and then has given us Torah and mitzvot as a guide for us to spend our entire lives in the great adventure of coming to know God. There is it's very clear from Chazal across the board that human beings are, to the extent that there is a higher and lower, we're much higher than the Malachim. And we see it right here. Human beings have the ability to get to know God, Bezrat Hashem. And we are charged, Rambam charges us to spend our entire lives in that quest, the quest for knowledge and connection to Kadosh Baruch Hu. Angels don't have that. They know. He says right here. Right. And when you have this complete knowledge, it's like you can either have one or the other, but you can't have them both. Right? You can't have this complete, ultimate, final knowledge and have free choice. Because if you have total knowledge, then you stop. If you have incomplete knowledge, then you're always going to have a choice between, do I look for it here? Do I look for it here? Do I look for it with this action? Do I look for it with that action? How am I guided? Okay. So it's very important the way Rambam uses these different forms of the verb to know. He says these angels have life, whatever that is, I don't know, and that they have a recognition, and yodeim oto dat gedola ad limaod, and they have ultimate, complete knowledge of God. And yet, also, each one of them has a different level, if you will, of, call it, intellectual capacity. And so just as the angels are ranked in terms of their level, if you will, of influence and interaction with the physical cosmos, they're also ranked with the, call it with their angelic IQ, right? The extent to which they have an actual knowledge of God. Okay, let's see. Can we finish this? We got 4 minutes, I think, not today. So let's just say let's finish with paragraph number 9. Kol hanimtzaim chutz min haboreh mitzora harishona ad yitosh katan shehe betabor haaretz hakol mikoach amitato nimtzau. Every existing thing, except for the creator of all existing things, from this first form, whatever the Tzora Rishona is, maybe let's call it the Big Bang, perhaps, to the smallest gnat, the smallest mosquito down in the depths of the earth, right? All of these, through the power of what Rambam says, mikoach amitato, from the power of God's truth. In other words, as we said, we use the also perhaps not completely satisfactory philosophic term of God as a necessary being, meaning that God's existence is absolute and is not dependent on anything. As the Baal HaTanya says, not in Tanya, but in another one of his writings in the Maimar, he says, don't limit God to the notion of infinity. God creates infinity, right? So that God's existence transcends our notions of the infinite, right? It's absolute and transcendent. And everything else that exists from Mount Everest to the tiniest mosquito all exists by virtue of its connection to God's, let's call it, necessary existence. לפי שהוא יודע עצמו ומכיר גדולתו ותפארתו ואמינתו, הוא יודע הכל, ואין דבר נעלם ממנו. And since God knows all these things, and knows God's own self, recognizes God's own greatness and God's own beauty and God's own truth, then God therefore knows everything, and nothing is hidden from God. B'ezrat Hashem, next week, we will begin with paragraph 10, where Rambam famously describes, gives us a description of the mechanism, if you will, of how God knows things. Which again it's a critical part of his thinking. Thank you for bearing with these couple of prakim. They are, please?
Can we connect with what you have just said for next week, to Perek Sheni of Tanya? Because it's the same point.
Probably not, because this is not a shir in Tanya. I'm happy to give a shir in Tanya, which is separate. We can take a look. I don't want to get too sidetracked. Rambam is sidetracking us enough with his cosmology here, and we're reading it because it's Rambam, and I think it's important for us to at least have a surface understanding of the structure of the cosmos, the way Rambam lays it out. I want us to think. Yeah, but sorry?
Chapter 2 speaks about exactly.
No, of course, yes, he quotes this exactly. No, of course, but I also want us, more to think about what are the behavioral implications of Rambam's cosmology, right? Every theological thinker who describes God and describes the world, a set of moral instructions. And I haven't quite worked out all the answers myself either. I think it's even, just as Rambam says, getting to know God is a lifelong project. Getting to understand Rambam takes a really long time too. But I would urge us all to look at, that there are very clear implications for how a society is supposed to be structured that emerge from Rambam's cosmology. And I think that the big lesson from this is not, do we have a sphere, and is it, earth, air, fire, water, and are there angels, and the big angels and little angels, but what are the implications for us as human beings? What are the implications for us as Jews of how we should behave ourselves and how we should interact and how we should behave with and treat one another? So we are now at 11 o'clock. It's a real zchut for me, a real honor to be part of this. I thank you very much for joining me today. B'ezrat Hashem, we'll see each other next week, either screen to screen or face to face. But before too long, I hope we're all together again. B'ezrat Hashem. Amen. Amen. Thank you.